Thank you very much for joining this distinguished public lecture of the East Asian Institute. My name is Bert Hoffman. I'm the director of the East Asian Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Robert Boyer, who I will introduce in a moment, on an absolutely fascinating topic, the transformation of contemporary capitalism, 7 lessons. And I think this is a very timely topic. I think post-COVID, many capitalisms, and that is a plural, are really in crisis. It's not the first time that they're in crisis. And before the lecture, we were discussing that I was learning from Michel Albert, Capitalisme contre Capitalisme, capitalism against capitalism, back in the early 90s, which was where there was a big debate about what shape of should capitalism take. And of course, Schumpeter, who wrote Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy in the 1940s, after the big crisis of capitalism of the 1930s. One capitalism seems to be working quite well, but is also currently reshaping, and that is the one in China, of course, that we are in East Asia are particularly interested in. But there's many forms and shapes of capitalism, as Professor Boyer will explain, and the transformation he sees in that and the importance for developed as well as in developing countries. I'm exceedingly pleased to have Professor Robert Boyer here to give the distinguished public lecture. Robert Boyer is a French economist, and he's trained at the École Polytechnique and the Sciences Po in Paris and Paris University. He was previously a senior researcher at the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique and professor at the École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales. He is now a fellow at the Institut des Amériques in Paris, and I'm very pleased to say that he's also collaborating with the East Asian Institute in some of the research that we are doing. He has developed a historical and comparative analysis of the institutional transformation of capitalism under the label of the Regression Theory, and he has written extensively on that and many other things. You can find his CV on the website and also in his own website, so I won't give you all the detail because we want to hear from Professor Robert Boyer. One logistic issue, if you have a question, please use the Q&A button. I will read out the questions. It's pretty hard to get people into the webinar. So if you allow me, I will read out your question. Please identify yourself if you ask a question, and then we can have a good discussion after Professor Boyer's lecture. He will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. Professor Boyer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation. It is for me a pleasure and an honor to share with you my views, problem with my, okay, here it is. So regression theory was born out of the finding that it was the end of the golden age in the US and in France. And what was important for the founding fathers, remember it was a team of French economists. Many of them are probably known, Michel Guetta, Alain Piet, my friend Jacques Mistral. We want to explain both the success of the Second World War II golden age and the reason of the exhaustion of the growth. And therefore, what we have been doing, why for this? Because the regime, the name we gave to this regime ended up. And second, what are the new regimes emerging out of the struggle of actors in order to find out new compromise in order to try to trigger growth. Therefore, during the last 40 years, we have been working on the updating and the extension of the regulation theory. And therefore, what was very interesting, we have been mobilizing 2 concepts, which that I will use in the subsequent part of my presentation. The first concept is endo-metabolism. In this context, we see that traditionally crises came from external big shocks that destabilize the economy. For the regulationists, it is the very success of a configuration of the economy which is so successful that adverse trends progressively emerge and they do destabilize the existing regime. This is the name of very important. So self-transformation leads from success to crisis. And it is very important to understand contemporary evolution. The second concept is, of course, hybridization, in the sense that, for example, back in the times of Michel Albert, the French elite want to imitate, to mimic the German capitalism. It was more efficient. But we never have been successful because given the style of management, the style of state intervention, you could not totally imitate the German, for example, international relation into France. Therefore, you have the process of hybridization in the sense that capitalism came in France, but with very specific forms, given the role of the welfare state. And we call this process hybridization. You have normal pressure in order to adopt capitalist rights, but they are not adapted or transformed in order to, and this will be very central in order to understand the case of ASEAN book, in the sense that many people were expecting it will be the kind of symmetry or implementation of very well-known model. On the contrary, I can try to show you that it is a very distinctive model. Unfortunately, I will not be very convincing because I need data. I will send you the PowerPoint. Therefore, I will develop the 7 following ideas, very simple. First, why East Asia is so important? Because it has been challenging the idea of the club of developing economies was not closed. And this is very important. This is a very important form of capitalism. It is destroying some old forms, but creating new ones. And ASEAN countries are. Second result, ASEAN capitalism are very different from the most of the rest of the world. Third result, and it is very important because we are living the time of regional integration. Geographical proximity does not mean identical branch of capitalism. For example, we will see that in East Asia, you have China and Singapore do not share the same type of capitalism. What I will try to apply in this framework is endogenic China. And I will try to defend the idea that you have a highly specific form of capitalism with 2 characteristics. First, a multi-level governance in which the dynamism is at the local level for accumulation and the control is at the central level. But you have also the fact that state intervention is not only governed by searching for good economic performance and stability, but also to warrant the legitimacy and stability of the existing economic power. So when you combine the leading role of political objectives and the different objectives at the various levels, you have both an interpretation of the dynamism of this economy, very distinct from the Russian one, and the factor of crisis. Fifth result, I do not like so much the concept of globalization. I prefer the concept of interdependence, of complementary accumulation regime or socio-economic regime. And it is very important. For example, US and China used to play a quite complementary role given their complementarity in economic terms, even if they were highly rival in terms of political hegemony. The sixth result, very important, is that we are in a vanishing international regime, in the sense that all the institutions of Bretton Woods are either blocked or vanishing or decaying in their power, and we are pressure in order to find out new configuration. And of course, as you might have noticed, China plays a very important role. The seventh result that I have to hurry up, in that national governments are in a very difficult position now, because once upon the time, they knew perfectly where were the trends of the international economy. Now, they don't know if we go toward a one world or a backlash toward nationalism, protectionism, and dislocation of the world economy. And the task is very important. Let me go very quickly. The first element was to note that the East Asian has been very specific, whereas you had stagnation nearly in most of Latin America countries, you had a very rapid rate of growth, and among Asia, clearly China is rather exceptional in the speed of growth. In the sense, some of my friends have looked the concept of compressed development for the case of China. What took 1 century in England took only 3 decades for China. Second result, my Japanese colleagues have been making data analysis, gathering on the data of how to characterize industrial relations, form of competition, type of education, degree of integration into the world economy, and so on. And they have been pulling this data and applied to Asian countries. And they were very surprised that none of this capitalism is a replication of Western capitalism. You had what they called insular semi-agrarian capitalism for Indonesia and the Philippines. You had trade-led industrializing in Malaysia and Thailand and China. City capitalism for Singapore and Hong Kong. Hong Kong was in the past before the replication. Innovation-led capitalism in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And what is very, very impressive is that they do not accept for Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. They are very far away from Western world capitalism. So in a sense, what are the specificity? Is clearly the distinction between 2 variables. Either education is very important phenomenon like for Singapore, or is it labor regulation, as is the case for most of other countries in Asia? And the second element, are you highly sophisticated in terms of manufacturing, or do we still have a very modest contribution of manufacturing? You have then, if you go to the Western part, advanced liberal capitalism, Australia, Canada, Ireland, welfare capitalism, all European countries, and European mixed capitalism, Spain, France, Greece, and so on. So what is very, very important is that, therefore, globalization has been exacerbating the specific features of each of the forms of capitalism. And if you repeat from decade to decade this data analysis, contrary to what many people think, you have not at all any convergence in the long run, but you have most of the capitalism, especially East Asian capitalism, still remain into the same zone characterized by distinctive institutional property, because institutions are largely inertial. Third result, geographical proximity is not promoting convergence. It is, I think, the big error in the launching of euro. It was supposed that now we have common currency, therefore we will converge. On the contrary, on the path, you have diverging adjustment of exchange rate, but allows a quite similar rate of growth. If you have the common policy, this common policy is not adapted to all countries, and therefore you have a diverging trends, which is exactly what we have been observing. So in the case of European Union, clearly you had clearly the consolidation of a dual model, which was already that of France and Germany, in the sense Germany is innovation and export-led, where France still is domestic consumption-led. And they are complementary. You have an external deficit of France, a huge surplus of Germany, not only of France, but of the rest of the world. So clearly, what is very important, be careful, regional integration promotes a redistribution of division of labor within the zone, which clearly calls for a form of solidarity, which was, remember, the plan New Generation in June or last year. Then in US, Canada, and Mexico have negotiated a new regional treaty, and clearly there are more and more integrated, but Mexico is clearly indirect investment led. Canada is natural resource led, and US, of course, is finance led. So clearly, they belong to the same space, but and in East Asia, you have exactly the same difference as I was mentioning, and of course, the trajectory are highly different. Let me now turn to China, and this is a pity because I have a very beautiful diagram to show you. So what is very important is that in the literature, you are mixing state and market. And I think it's not a good starting point. We should mix economics and politics. If you are doing this, you have an interpretation of the very specific nature of the Chinese company. Let me describe the diagram. You have three entities. At the society-wide level, you have an implicit compromise. The party state versus population, the party state promise better standard of living, which is now common prosperity, but in exchange, the population is giving political support to the Communist Party. So this is implicit, and this permeates all the various phases of the growth. At the local level, you have a local, what we call local cooperatives, in the sense property rights are very fuzzy in the case of China. But entrepreneurs have to have some trust in the stability of the compromise that links them to the local authority. In the sense, the protection given by the local authority is entitled the dynamism of the firm, and by the tax they generate, they can sustain the legitimacy of local authority. And then you have a firm block, which is very important, the link between local political elite and national elite. If you are as a head of a local authority, you have a good record for growth, social peace, and so on, you can be made elected for going up in the promotion of the Communist Party. And in a sense, in this case, you are the political compliance to the party is linked to the economic success. And in passing, what is very important at this local level, since the local fiscality is not very good, the locality are selling the right to use the soil in order to finance local public goods. And this explains you why the current crisis of the real estate sector, because in a sense, you have been creating such an oversupply by credit that you have big pressure according to this model. And what is very important in this model, you understand that it is not at all the equivalent of Russia, and it is not at all the US model. You have a very unique model, and I will not reserve for the question, what are the next types of crises that can emerge? It is very important. Given this phenomena, this structural analysis, we can detect, and that the regime has been until now very much more resilient than most foreign observer was imagining. Let me now turn to the fifth point, that is to replace the concept of globalization. So what is very important, observe the rise of oil price now. Oil price are the main asset for rentier economy that are like from Saudi Arabia to Venezuela, they are selling oil against commercial commodities. So what is very important in this world, you have an exacerbation of primary resources production and the production and selling of manufacturing goods, which is the first opposition. The second opposition is clearly between some economies that are highly specialized in manufacturing, for example, in the case of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and in other countries, the UK or US, you have highly specialized in service economy. And this, what is very important, so Asia appears as very poor in terms of natural resources, therefore it has been inserting into the world economy as a subcontractor for the global value chains originating from the delocalization from the US and for Europe. So what is very important and why I'm working for Institut des Amériques in Paris, why Asia is more successful than Latin America, because Latin America are specialized in primary resource export. We are totally dependent from the speed of the world economy, whereas many East Asian countries have been able to climbing up the ladder of specialization in manufacturing goods. In a sense, they are, in a sense, complementary and not at all competing. It is very important to understand. Let me mention the importance of my analysis of pure rentier economy. Saudi Arabia, no manufacturing, as well as Venezuela, I understand better the polarization of the world economy. Therefore, in a highly dense diagram, I will try to summarize for you. Imagine you have four actors at the world economy. At the left side, you have US, and US is highly specialized in deregulation, the innovation in high technology sector, deregulation and financial innovation. And you have a finance-led Brazil. In the sense, everything is up to the stock market valuation. But on the other side, in Asia, you have China, in which you have clearly a competitive-led accumulation regime, in the sense that the country is so huge that any center is fighting with other centers in order to benefit from increasing returns to scale in producing goods that can be sold in the world market. And the first complementarity that appears is that during the last decade, not this one, the US consumer benefited from the import of low-priced goods made from China, and conversely, the central bank of China could buy treasury bond of the US in order to fuel credit-led consumption by American consumers. So paradoxically, you have a wonderful complementarity between the two factors. So it was what was called G2. What was the place of Latin America? Clearly totally dependent. When you have both the boom of the finance led in the US and the boom in China, you have a super bonanza, in Castellano, for the price of natural resources, which created the illusion that Latin American countries could go out of underdevelopment. It was the drama of Brazil. When that was a missing actor, it is Europe. And Europe is clearly a welfare in comparison. In the sense, you have an extended solidarity via progressivity of tax and an impressive welfare on education, health, retirement, pension, family allowance, and so on. And this model used to be very efficient when the economy was not so open. When you open the economy, finance coming from the US is destabilizing, for example, the euro. And conversely, the pressure of China on the production, for example, of new equipment goods is challenging one of the specialties of Germany. So in a sense, the European Union is the weak partner. It is challenged by repetitive global crises created by US and the impressive surge of China and Asian competitors that make irrelevant most of the agile capital of the European Union. So you understand better that the most recent result for regulation has been the fact that you have complementary regime, but nobody is equal, and you have two leaders and two dependent economies. I do not speak so much of Africa because Africa is very dependent. What is, I will six results, I'm sorry not to be able to benefit from the diagram, but the following is first, what is very important, I am struck by the rise of populism, not only in Europe, but in many other countries. And this populism goes along with the defense of national sovereignty. So you have seen in my previous presentation that you have big winners, big losers at the world economy. And the loser country can imagine that the solution is to have a populist movement defending the standard of living of domestic population against the transnational capital. And what is first, the temptation again, and in Europe, it's named European productive sovereignty. So you see, it is a shift of language. It's not opening to free but to try to recover European sovereignty in economic terms. And the second element that is forgotten, since the early of this century, you have a declining contribution of world trade to domestic growth. So in a sense, the global chain of value have been so extensive, the cost of transportation have been rising due to natural resources and oil price augmentation, that de facto you have a limit to the reliability of this mechanism. And when the COVID is hitting all the countries, you realize that most of the domestic productive systems are dependent on large concentration of production, either in India for the pharmaceutical or even in China for manufacturing. In such a way that in this mechanism, you have the tentative to have diverging reaction to the same event. Then the question is then, can we find an alliance for creating a new international regime? For example, the issue at stake should be, could we have an international organization for organizing the fight against climate change? Could we have, similarly, I'm dreaming, an external organization for governing the huge migration, international migrations are expected from climate change. If you are looking, imagine I make here the hypothesis that nation states defend their own interest, but this interest is shaped by the type of accumulation regime. And therefore, I have a map in which I imagine very different strategy out of the current crisis. The first one should be domestic growth, economic specialization, building rents, and you have on the other side, given my regime, I'm finance-led, I absolutely need the openness of the world economy. And each of the model, I will not go into the detail, the rentier economy are absolutely interested in the opening of the world economy. And the question is, do the interaction of all these requirements push toward a compromise? And the answer, the professional answer, is not. On the contrary, it is promoting very different strategy for again, China is quite interesting because China is both invading such international organization such as telecom organization, international transport, and on the other side, building at the regional level parallel institutions that can be used in order to, at the moment given, to replace the global institution of the world. So you have clearly diverging there. And of course, the US is dramatically defending after the Trump episode, try to recover the initiative in consolidating institutions that favor Western world. Several results. Then let's go to the where governments are. Then I think, personally, I'm surprised that so many people want to become president of France, because the task has never been so difficult, because you have to design a strategy that could be resilient, whatever the evolution of the world economy. That is to say, if you have the dislocation, if you have the country pulling national sovereignty in regional zone, or pure dislocation of the world economy. So clearly, what is very difficult, you have to take a decision, for example, in terms of energy, of climate change, but you don't know what will be the international regime. In the sense, the international regime is now leading in the sense of, and we can imagine 4 scenarios. The first one, and it is pushed by the repetition of pandemic, highly probable. The fact that climate change is now a reality. So therefore, you have one global world. For example, in the case of health, one health at the world level. So clearly, you have this pressure. We should build a common, in the sense of a public good that is necessary for the world economy to operate. But second scenario, you have a cold or hot economic war between, for example, US and China. And look carefully, the continuity between Trump president and Biden president is that clearly the big issue for America is to think that now China is a systemic rival to the US. And clearly this should be another evolution of the world. Do government choose to belong to the US side or to the Chinese side? So it will be a new divided world, as it was the past between the world influenced by Russia and the world influenced by US. Then, and it is my favorite scenario, maybe we are living a regionalization. Observe the fast reinforcement of the solidarity in the European sector area. Look at the continuity of the NAFTA, the North America trade, which has been de facto deepening the relation between the 3 countries. In a sense, and I was very amazed by the new treaty negotiated, implemented this January, which gathered China and ASEAN country with the largest free trade zone in the world. So in a sense, and why it is a very important phenomenon, because if you can organize division of labor and solidarity in financial management at the regional level, maybe you get immunity by the next financial crisis that might be created by US speculative movement in the financial sector or in Wall Street. So in a sense, regionalization becomes a way, an intermediate position between world organizations that cannot be designed like conflicts of national interest, and the other side, the fact that medium-sized country become very small and large-sized country become medium in the world. So therefore, you have to pull your own resources. And the 4th scenario is one nationalism. You can feedback effect of what from one nationality to another one. So clearly, it will be the temptation to apply whatever it costs. And I'm using this expression, but in the sense, for example, if you look at the vote of Brexiters, most of the pro-Brexit admitted that their standard of living would be deteriorating, but they were ready to pay for it because it was reconstructing the dignity and the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. So in a sense, nationalists could accept large economic costs for the fact of being independent. And now the fact that we are living this element in a diagram as the kind of table showing the probability of each of these scenarios. Let me conclude briefly by 7 conclusions. First, we live a very troubled period, in which theories are lagging with respect to the very fast evolution of society and economic sphere. So we need a theory that admits that we don't go from one equilibrium to another equilibrium. We have a complex process of permanent social change. And to be frank, the regulation theory is one of such change. It's not the only one, but it is why we have been developing the work much more than simple analysis of the founding, a very specific mode of growth based on the synchronization of mass consumption and mass production, because we have been able to adapt. For example, I've been designing a model back in 2000 of finance-led growth, and I was surprised that this regime can be relatively resilient until a threshold when it collapses. So what is very interesting, we have been inventing, the actors have been inventing new development modes, and the theory should try to analyze them. Second, I think regulation theory is based on the idea that you have a resilient capitalism. If you go back to Marx, his prediction that the system is so unbalanced, so unequal, so crise-prone, that it will probably end up in a global collapse, which we have been constructing its alternative to face. If you are looking carefully at the historians, economic historians, Marx, we have encountered each crisis has been an opportunity for the generation of a new form of capitalism. So that's exactly the case of the interwar of the last crisis of the last century, in which you had mass production in the 20s, but no mass consumption. Via a reform of the labor relation, new Keynesian policy, you invent a new form of capitalism driven by mass consumption. So second result, be careful, capitalism is very resilient, and it is why you have a multiplication of capitalism by the process of hybridization. Third result, East Asia is an emblematic example of such a successful hybridization. Totally different from African or Latin American failure. So clearly, and for example, just a joke, clearly Singapore is not a replication of state capitalism. So you see the power of capitalism, it transcends the national frontiers, and it helps to interact with local idiosyncrasy to design new forms of capitalism. And the example, the most impressive for me, has been China. Fourth result, globalization is a very misleading concept, because it assumes that everything is nearly equal, and we are becoming a big global village. No, we are becoming an arena where complementary in good periods, but conflicting, contrasted socio-economic regimes. And in a sense, globalization has been exacerbating interdependency. And second, the ability for emerging new political conflicts about management of the domestic economy and the world economy. Fifth result, what is very impressive in the Korean period of the dialogue, the G2 between US and China, is that the mild economic complementarity I've been describing, the United States and China benefiting, they had unbalanced domestic regime, but joining them, the imbalance of one country was compensating the imbalance of the other country. So it was, in a sense, in spite of rhetorical attack on the political side, de facto we were dependent. Now you have in a period of global strategic rivalry, and this puts at risk the very stability of the world economy, because clearly you don't have any accord, for example, on something as difficult as climate change. You have rhetorical accord, but clearly you don't have, because each of the two camps have very different vision about what should be the next international institution. Sixth result, you can, it's impossible to make a projection for the next international institution, because clearly you have such pressure from populism for investing again in defending national sovereignty, or European national sovereignty, that it's very unlikely that you accept to give part of national responsibility to a world level responsibility. So you have clearly a dead end in the reconstruction. And my argument is that you might anticipate an acceleration of regional integration. Even the Latin American countries now perceive that they should defend their own interests, given that they cannot expect any recovery from the rest of the world. They should organize, for example, their own division of labor in the manufacturing sector, just to try to comply with the objective of development in Latin America. So clearly, and everybody of us will be ready in case of brutal financial world crisis. They were the retreats in which they would be ready to reorganize new compromise at the national level. Seventh result, I think all governments are facing an unprecedented task, because not only have they to minimize unemployment, try to respond to social demands, but they have to be sure that tomorrow an unexpected event, let it be a hurricane, a new virus, a new financial crisis, may destroy the very core of the strategy. So clearly, the big novelty is the following: to design policies so well conceived that they take into account the relative probability of the four scenarios I've been mentioning, just to be sure that the system does not collapse by betting only, for example, into one state of the world for the international institution. And just thinking Singapore, that is a city, what we call, my Japanese colleague called a city capitalism. I imagine the big difficulty of running this policy. It probably run about diversification, preparing to the next crisis, organizing anti-stochastic response by public spending and reserve and so on. So I imagine, if my analysis is true, the world conception of the world economy should be redesigned. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry being so quick, but I hope you will be stimulated by all the very difficult things I've been proposing to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Boyer. And I don't think we missed the PowerPoint. As a matter of fact, I like the clarity of your thoughts and the clarity of your points. And I'm sure we're going to get quite a few questions. But let me start with one. And that is you seem to start, one of your earlier remarks was that you almost described China as one of the ideal forms of capitalism, i.e. decentralized, with central leadership, with lots of innovation coming up from bottom up to the center. First, the question is that intended? But second, we are in an era where that seems to be changing, where under the leadership of Xi Jinping, there seems to be more centralization, more common features, less regional diversity. So what would that mean for China's capitalism going forward?
Okay, very good question. I was waiting for it. No, it's not ideal. I was very surprised capitalists to be able to function within a very strong communist party. Because remember, the strongest the Soviet were, the weaker the Russian economy. So for me, it was a surprise. It can't function. Second, you are right. Many people, American scholars, was thinking with adhesion to the World Trade Organization. More trade brings prosperity. Prosperity means middle classes. Middle class need democracy and market. Quite on the contrary, you have a recovery by state. State is taking again many of initiatives. For example, you had the big Alibaba CIO was again, you work for the Communist Party or you stop being CIO. So clearly you have the idea. I like economic dynamics because it brings prosperity to the people we can distribute. But you have followed the line of the leading Communist Party. And I think the model is full of contradiction. One is pollution. For example, you have some difficulty to do so. Clearly, you have such a polluted city, but for example, the life expectancy in the more dense region is declining. Okay, first. Second element, you have such increasing water to scale, but even domestically, you do form monopoly. And the Communist Party don't want to have the equivalent of GAFAM in China with all the power of corruption of, for example, local political elites. So the second element, wealth accumulation is so intense that the Communist Party might fear to be overrun by, it is the case of in the US, the stronger multinational do govern the political life. Third contradiction, you have you need to have common prosperity, and as you know, you have a rapidly aging population, you have a very frugal welfare state, and in distressed region, you absolutely need to build a minimum solidarity, and for this you need either transfer from the public budget or increase of revenues. And then you have a big conflict between Beijing, see what you have to shift income distribution in the direction of wage and welfare. But at the local level, since the accumulation is profit-led, if you pay more wage, you slower rate of growth, and then you're losing. And this struggle is not over. So you have a basic structural struggle between short-term power at the local level and long-term view by Beijing. Third, the lack of taxation at the local level. The only form of taxation was to sell the right of using, for developers, real estate developers. And this created a very perverse mechanism of oversupply, over-credit, over-indebtedness, and you have a firm limit of this mechanism. On the contrary, I do not think that the Americans are right in thinking that the innovation system will be killed by the retaliation, because you have such an impetus. But my argument is the following. Where is the most modern productive capital in the world? In China, of course. Because given the rates of accumulation, they have what is the most sophisticated army? It is in China, because it is brand new. So what the people are totally confusing is that China is nearly at the frontier of any, and therefore the idea that it will collapse because that in coping America is too late. You have to be putting break 15 years before. Now it's too late. You have, of course, difficulties, but they will overrun because by definition, they want to be autonomous in terms of innovation. And this is the strong point of US pilot paper capitalism. Chinese accumulate productive forces. And in the long run, they will win, of course, because you need buildings with factories and paper property rights is good, but they can be denied by the rest of the world. So the long-term strategy, whatever the crisis of China may incur, because you can imagine crisis, they are building for productivity. So the real power, economic power is shifting to and out of US. And so why and it's not at all ideal. Okay. And one of the perils, and I will finish, is that the cult of personality. Because what was nice in the previous president, in the sense of a kind of gentle agreement with the various parts of the society, within the Communist Party of Gosdorf. And now you have a man, Mao-like, saying, I'm the king, I know everything, follow me. And this is very dangerous because in one mind, you have less than in nine. So the over structural fragility is the arrogance. We are the better, because then you make big mistakes and you are losing your hegemony. So you understand. So as you might say, it's not an ideal model. All the contradictions are here. But last but not least, you have the arm and the protection. The disequilibrium in China are enormous, but you have the most clever public administration I know. Imagine a very clumsy administration like in the US, facing in China, China would explode immediately because the contradiction is true. Here you have big problem and a huge intelligence service in order to try to accommodate. So, and nobody knows who will win, but it's not the pure mechanical catastrophe, for nothing. No, it's much more sophisticated than this. But I think you are totally right. Most theory of social science should address how do you envision China? And this is very important because then you have concepts you can apply elsewhere. And this is very important, in my feeling, to understand it.
I have a question from Jafar Suyamangolo. And I'm going to generalize it a little bit, but he notes that you mentioned the rapid industrialization of East Asia and Southeast Asia. But he mentions there's also enormous stress on the environment. And how can the East Asian capitalism deal with that? Now, I would like to generalize it a little bit because we also have a big global environmental problem. And it may be big enough to derail a lot of the international cooperation. The Europeans are currently thinking about a border adjustment, which basically is a border tax on carbon that might be A, politically very controversial, but B, also be enormously disruptive for the current balances in the world economy. So how does capitalism locally as well as globally deal with that big environmental question?
I think there is a big difficulty because by definition, if I think about species diversity, it can be dealt locally. Okay, so you can of water sanitization, you have more. Okay, so you are locally. What is dramatic with climate change is that it is a global future common good, and therefore everybody should contribute. But then I'm very pessimistic for two reasons. The first one, if you make the maximum effort, and you need the strategy of Europe will be so good pupil, but everybody will be inspired by us. But we are polluting very little because we are not manufacturing power. Whereas other countries, developing countries say, the Western world has been polluting during centuries, we have the right to pollute again. So clearly, you have a huge imbalance of the interest. Second, you have a question of long-termism. What I am impressed by is that when I look presidential elections all over the world, it is short-termism. Remember the discussion about Brexit, it was clearly short-term mechanism. Whereas global climate change assumes a huge stability of the objective of development. But even, for example, even in Europe, you have the rhetoric of full conscience of the global climate. But look, in Germany, for example, the CIO imprint has been growing due to the stopping of nuclear. So you have a big divorce rhetorics and taking into account now the future. And it would be a good time because we really invest negative. It would be a good time to invest, but it's not the case. People continue to invest in the way people. Second, third remark, you have to think about French yellow jacket. Because when you put this tax, The people were unable to pay for the extra taxes because they were in houses bad isolation. They need to use their car. You have a bad heating system and so on. So brutally, for them, the cost was totally unequally shared. And it is the case at the world level. So when you mix all these factors, I fear that climate change will be much more dramatic than the 1.5, 2.5 degrees, because clearly you have a dramatic temporality, the drama of time horizons, and the drama of public goods, free riders. I will others do efforts, and I will benefit from it. And in this sense, Europe is very naive. We will not enable to move the world population. Clearly, the Chinese will be to add. So the only solution for the case of China would be you have storms, you have instability and so on, such that your self-interest promotes you to try to be part of the mechanism, to be convinced that it is from your future, not only the other one. And this is not clear. The big hope is that all my young students their only political belief is ecology. So, okay, but it will take 3 decades to comply with. You see my point. So I'm very skeptic about this element. And look, last year has been revealing the harshness of this 5 hurricane tornado. Clearly, there is something changing. And nevertheless, for example, in the French budget, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. Rhetorically, yes, but not anything has been made new. It will be next year. Okay. So I think we should be very careful about this. But maybe since Asia is growing, you can devote a part of the income to this public good. Whereas the drama of Europe will go up 1% a year maximum. It's difficult to fulfill aging population, healthcare, and defend climate. So you said that because Asia is so rich that you can maybe try to have like the golden age for you. You can try to have them both. It will be very nice because China is contributing massively as the US to the CO2 increase.
I am going to come back to the environmental point in a moment, but we first have Dr. Chen-Ji Wei, who has the following question. The bargaining outcome between labor and capital were critical in the capitalism of post-war Europe, as you have argued. How do you foresee to have such a similar process in China about sharing production surpluses? You say they're not a welfare state yet, or a very minimal welfare state. Is there an upcoming battle for the surpluses, and if so, how would that take shape in China?
For the time being, you have a competitive wage formation. When at the local level accumulation is booming, you have increase in real wage. But okay, so clearly you have a mechanism, but it is a competitive one. If you have a slowdown, you have a slowdown of wage increase. And the idea of the Beijing government was to push a kind of norm in wage increase, first to sustain, to prevent poverty to return, and second, a very important argument, to have a highly productive economy, you need a high wage economy. This is the lesson I drive from Scandinavian countries. So clearly it will be nice. But then you have a basic conflict between at a local level. Let the market from the demand from other regions, but I keep my wage competitive in order to take the market. So clearly you have a big conflict of this issue. And the second mechanism should be subsidy transfer. And of course, as you know perfectly, the budget has been shifting public spending from the coast to the inner regions. But it is very mild. Compared, for example, what interests me is the likely poverty of aging population in rural zones, the most isolated one. Sometimes I'm dreaming in new Mao is emerging because they are not unequal, they are unable to survive when they are old. So, and so there is a big tension. And in my recent paper, I've been addressing that this is a structural barrier for common prosperity. It's not evident. So the will of the government since 15 years is the direction, but for the time being, you don't have the new model. And this is very challenging because in the long run, the difficulty comes from the pauperization of a part of the marginal population, which make political turmoil, which is very important for the Communist Party. So I think this is the danger, much more than the secession of middle class to have democracy. No, the danger is the left from the common prosperity by lack of transfer in the distressed regions. But I think this is very important because, and in a sense, the weakness of labor representation, where in the end of the Communist Party, prevent to have the equivalent of collective bargaining convention in the US. So they are impeached, not prevented to have this. And this is a strong because if you, and of course, imagine workers being limited in a central, it will be a countervailing power that the Communist Party cannot admit. So you have a dilemma. You need divided workers, and then it's difficult to have clearly this domestic wage-led regime.
The next question is from Jose Montes Claros of RSIS here at the National Nanyang Technology University. And he'd like your to shed light on the question of, is industrial policy back, and what experience can other countries draw from the successes of China?
Yes, I think what is very interesting, because one of my specialties is a comparative analysis of national system of innovation. And I was totally amazed because I began 15 years ago. I could not imagine that such a poor country, because in terms of income per capita, China is still very, very low, to be able to increase permanently the fraction devoted to innovation and to be successful, because you can increase it, but it can go to be wasted. And I'm very amazed by the relative success. For example, I've been studying the electric car and so on. So in a sense, you have a high responsiveness given the diversity of localities. So in a sense, you see people, I was thinking that you had a Soviet type, one size for all. No, due to local cooperatives, you have on a wide variety of extent, and this is a strength. And second, you had the equivalent of DARPA, some priority asset in space, in artificial intelligence, and so on, in which you have money, and the competition and the dynamism of Chinese entrepreneurs makes them to comply with this element. So my argument is that with a high probability, within 1 decade, the most dynamic innovation system will be that of China, paradoxically, because it will be it will be from space to biology to intelligence, everything, arms. It will be a self-sufficient innovation system. And this will totally change the power of negotiation between US, because by definition, you can curb counter-retaliation, you already. And I'm very impressed, finally, by the cleverness of the policy. You send to any country, any university, Chinese students, and they come back, are given a lot of money to develop new, at the technical frontier, research center. So you have an incredible mechanism in order to pass from increasing return to scale mass production to the mechanism in which you are, it is a scientific nation. For the time being, it's not totally fully, but because in a sense, they are a little bit Marxist. I think that in the long run, productive forces are the core of international supremacy.
I'd just like to make the observation that over the past 10 years, industrial policy is very much back in China. It's also the 10 years where China's growth slowed down quite significantly. So the question is still outstanding, I believe, how forceful industrial policy will be for China's, or the way China implements industrial policy. But it's a bigger question. I'd like to go to a final question. And you mentioned basically, well, you gave the driving forces of globalization, or if you want, the interdependencies among capitalisms that were very strong over the past 30, 40 years, and reinforced by WTO, reinforced by others, reinforced by opening up of China. Those complementarities seem to become less and less and less. And I said the sources of divergence or centripetal forces are getting larger. And I mentioned the environment already. The thinking about data and data security, which is very different between the blocs in the United States, Europe, and China. The thinking about issues such as human rights and political systems, and to what extent that affects economic relationships between countries. And then the fourth, of course, is because of the rise of China, the increasing strategic tensions. So you seem to be still quite optimistic about the future of interdependencies, and that it would be a more regional model. But will there still be interaction between those regional models of the US, Europe, and China? I know it's a very big question, but I would love to hear your views on this.
I think that my reading of the Chinese strategy is to shorten the links with the world economy, etc. Because in the previous crisis, they come from the US, and the Chinese have to react. So the idea, you need, of course, a global marketplace at the world level to exchange currency and so on. But you want to minimize the fact that in order to transact between Singapore and China, you don't need to go to New York. Okay, let's go at the regional center here, and then maximize the regional transaction. And for the imbalance between the region, which would exist, you have compassion center. So it will be my argument. And this is not, it is very interesting, because if so, you deepen regional division of labor. Because if you go this model, the model is organized via global value chain. If you try to organize the regional, you try to organize networks are resilient to a possible breaking down of the world order, because you are internalizing, and with the exception of natural resources, Asia is sufficiently strong to have a fully fledged. This is a nice thing, because you can negotiate long-term contracts with primary resources suppliers in order to be stabilized by the price. So it's really, really nice. You have a 10 years plan with fixed price, which totally stabilized. Imagine that's this mechanism, you will not have the big inflation. So my argument is that regionalization is a way. And why I do trust this? Because it will be a way in order to recompose 3 or 4 decades ahead a new international system, because you will have strong power, well organized, to negotiate what is done at the global level. Given you have constructed bargaining power at the local level, and you have you can retract the region. You don't need to say you have a huge negotiating power by the fact that you are not dependent anymore from the rest of the world, especially from New York. So the difficulty you have to fight against domestic nationalism. In Europe, you have at least 3 or 4 nationalists, populists, and so on. So we have to convince them to go. And my concern is that they could stop the progress of urbanization. So the drama, it would be the solution to speed up urbanization. And nationalism prevents this. So and so even the regional may break down. Why I'm not a political scientist, but I mentioned populism because it can play a role. So if people accept we are proud to be Polish and we don't care about the standard of living, it changed totally the bargaining in Brussels. So I think So you see, I perceive that it is shaky, regionalization, but it can be conceived. And de facto, it exists in North America. Mexico and Canada, whatever they like or not, go along with the US. So they are integral part of they can blame, nobody's embarked in the same boat. So you see, and you imagine how contrasted they are. Okay, they are not cousins. So no, I think, and it would be a good news for Europe, the last chance to compensate the defeat of the Second World War by being committing suicide by this work. We are out of the world. It will be the next chance to still belong to the network. So, but what is missing is talented political. Maybe I'm too depressed by the poor quality of candidate in France. It's impressive. I don't see the state, woman or man, able to be, or if there is one, there is not two or three. So the big problem is the lack of political talent to have this kind of vision in order to propel public opinion and not try to respond to the push about popularity. So you have a kind of deterioration of the quality of political discourse, which makes things very difficult.
All right. Well, it's not an optimistic note on which we end, but I do think there is still a way forward where we can save some of the good of globalization, and the different types of capitalisms can work together. I think we have in Asia, we have equally problems. You mentioned RCEP as a big success. One of the reasons that it became a big success is to not think too deeply and to make it fairly shallow, because you don't need to address everything at the same time. Europe, I think you can be a bit more optimistic. Yes, there's many problems, but at the same time, Europe has been a tremendous integration machine and a conversion machine, and Eastern Europeans have tremendously benefited from, and Mediterranean countries have tremendously benefited from Europe. So I think each and every region also has its strength that they tend to forget in times of tensions and in times of reviving nationalism. Professor Boyer, thank you so much for your lecture. It was a great joy to have you, and we have learned a lot. There's many people that, the most people stay, that is always my test. That people come, that's one, but staying, that is more important. So I think many were absolutely delighted to listen to you. And thank you so much. I wish you a very pleasant day and a great weekend in France.
May I add two things? First, sorry for the misfunctioning. I can provide you with the PowerPoint, but everybody could consult. And second, you could read one of my most recent books in English. It names Evolving Diversity of Capitalism in Springer Verlag, in which I have a comparative analysis of East Asian integration and European integration. And my argument is that we have been building too much rigid institution in Europe, preventing that economic dynamics, where in Asia, you have minimalist rules that foster innovation and growth. So I have a piece on this with exactly your conclusion. So thank you very much for your invitation. I hope we can collaborate on common issues if you are interested.
Thank you. We're very much so. Once again, thank you. And we will post your PowerPoint on our website, where we will also bring the link to the video registration of this lecture. Once again, thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Have a good night. Thank you so much.